As a child, our family was in church at least 3 times every week: Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Sunday mornings were for Sunday school and a rather predictable worship service. Wednesday nights were for Bible study. But Sunday nights, they were for the less structured services, and in that Pentecostal church, that meant that anything could happen. At that time, we still had some of the old stem-winding, fire and brimstone preachers from the sawdust trail of the early 20th century. One was Brother B.B. Benny Kitchum, a retired older man who always sat on the second row on the left side, usually pretty quietly, even to the point of nodding off occasionally. But sometimes he would be invited to preach on Sunday nights, and we watched as the fiery passion of his younger days came to life. Brother Benny had a unique preaching style. To begin his sermon, he would call out 5 or 6 people from the congregation, have them come and set up on the platform, and then he would assign to each of them, from memory, a particular passage from the Bible, the King James Version, of course, to be prepared to read when called upon as the Spirit moved him. No one, including Brother Benny, knew where the sermon was going to go. But we knew that it was going to be loud, delivered in a sing-songy voice, and said with great conviction. He'd be going along and suddenly point to one of his assistants. "Stand up and read," he would bark. Hebrews 11 would have been one of his favorites. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for. Well, that's as far as the reader would get before Brother Benny interrupted him, repeating the line to make sure that we heard it and felt every word. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for. Read. The evidence of the evidence. Read. The evidence of things not seen. To hear Brother Benny hold forth, it seemed that faith was a physical thing, something you could hold in your hand. You either had it or you didn't. And it was clear that Brother Benny had it. But I wasn't so sure about myself. I was a child, after all, still figuring out who I was and my place in the world, uncertain about most things. The Hebrew Christians, the first ones to hear this sermon in the first century, weren't so sure either. This congregation consisted of a small band of Jewish folks who had received the message of Jesus as the promised Messiah with joy and who enthusiastically followed him. That's how they started anyway. But now they were having doubts. The promise of the reign of God, marked by justice and peace, was nowhere in sight, and the people tauntingly let them know about it. They were subject to public ridicule. Some had property confiscated. Others were temporarily put in jail just to get their attention. Thus the price for nonconformity. So with their heads hanging low and their hearts dragging the ground, they received this document that we call the letter to the Hebrews. It's from a preacher who knows their situation and wants to encourage them to keep following in the way of Jesus. The author spends most of this sermon demonstrating how Jesus is superior to anything they have known in the past. But towards the end, the focus shifts. The dislocation and disruption they're feeling is nothing new, he tells them. In fact, it has been true of the people of God from the very beginning. In chapter 11, the preacher recalls a cast of characters from their Bible, our Old Testament, pointing out how each of them had been in fear and had overcome obstacles. By faith, Abel, son of Adam and Eve, offered God an acceptable sacrifice. By faith, Enoch was taken and did not experience death. By faith, Noah built an ark when there wasn't a rain cloud in the sky. Faith is mentioned 24 times in this chapter alone. But it soon becomes clear that the author understands faith not as something tangible that we possess, but as something that we do. Every one of these persons in the past died before realizing the promises of God, but yet they persisted in living faithful lives. This is especially true of Abraham and Sarah. This couple, well advanced in years and living comfortably in their home by the Persian Gulf, are called by God to start a new people, a great nation. It begins with a call to leave their home and go to a land that I will show you. That's it. The whole itinerary. Rather vague destination, a land that I will show you. And remarkably, they do just that. Load up what possessions they decide they can carry and head out of town. Now, you know that must have drawn some suspicious looks from the neighbors. Where are you going, Abraham? Don't know. Do you think you have everything you need for the journey? Not sure. Will you be coming back? I doubt it. Well, good luck with that. And with that first tentative step, surrounded by skeptical voices, Abraham and Sarah leave behind all that they knew, choke back their own apprehension, and step into a future they can't yet define. They have no written contract, no collateral or conditions, just a verbal promise and the hope that this invisible God will come through. They finally arrive in Palestine and somehow know in their hearts that this is the intended destination. But that realization really doesn't make them much happier. Whatever they were expecting, I'm sure that this was not it. The locals give them a hostile reception. God has promised them a son, an heir, but Sarah shows no signs of pregnancy. They have trouble establishing a permanent address. So they keep moving their tent around from one patch of sand to the next, their tattered hopes in tow. It's enough to make them question their decision to ever leave home. Discouragement sets in. The future looks bleak. Sound familiar? Maybe that little group of Hebrew Christians who are reading this sermon. In times of uncertainty, we're often tempted to look back to the past. Everything in us yearns for settlement, security, placement. If we could only go back to the way things used to be, the words cross our lips without thinking. And why not? We remember the times when the kids were at home, when everyone knew their neighbors, grandparents lived just across town. The parameters of community morals were fixed, and everyone knew what was expected of them. We understood the geography of our own souls, navigating the familiar turns and shadowy places just so we could hold it all together. At least that's what we tell ourselves. That's how we want to remember it. We can't know how much Abraham and Sarah may have been ready to cash it in and head back home to the palm trees, familiar haunts, their network of family and friends. But they didn't go back. They stayed. They stayed because this was where God had called them. Maybe they knew that the past was a mirage. Their true home was before them, wherever God was leading. Once that decision was made, they faced another temptation. Why not just adapt to their new surroundings in Canaan? Let's see if we can't blend in with the locals, adopt some of their values and goals, make life easy on ourselves. The prospect of accommodation could have lulled them in. Set up house, install a picket fence, join the bowling league. But becoming like everybody else wasn't the call that motivated them to leave their ancestral home, to travel hundreds of miles and to start over again in their old age. They accepted the fact that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth, that they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one, not dominated by the abuse of power and greed and selfishness, but one where love and mercy rule and everyone is considered of equal worth. In other words, Abraham and Sarah show that all of us who follow God are a pilgrim people. We'll always be restless in this world, never really settled, not feeling fully at home. As Nell Morton has said, home is not a place. Home is a movement, a quality of relationship, a state where people seek to be their own and increasingly responsible for their world. In his own way, I believe Brother Benny tapped into a profound insight regarding the Christian life. Living by faith will not come easy. Too many will encourage us to settle for small victories, to limit our vision to a narrow field of self-interest and tribal affiliation, even to start thinking that we can't make a difference anyway, so why try? But faith always draws us towards the promises of God. Faith tells us that we can't believe our eyes when we look at this dismal world, that there are realities we cannot see, where those in the valley of despair find release, where the emotionally walking dead find their lives restored, where hope is reborn again and again and again. God grants us the capacity to shape a vision of our future beyond what we can demonstrate, and then invites us to project ourselves into that future, to live today as if it was just around the corner. No wonder Brother Benny rattled the windows. And like all those heroes of faith who came before us, we also will have to face our fears and insecurities and step out in trusting hope. Emily Heath notes that for those of us who believe that we rest in the hands of an eternal and loving God, living a life full of fear is worse than dying. The great threat to Christian faith is not that we will not be safe from the world's dangers, but that we will be held captive by our fear of them, that we will have more faith in our fear than we have in Christ. Like Abraham and Sarah and countless others, we have to risk everything to find new life in God. Thea Racelis relates this to her experience as a foster parent. The worst advice I heard, she writes, was the warning to be cautious with our love. Well-meaning friends said things like, "You know this is risky, be careful." They didn't want Thea and her spouse to grow attached to a child who could have been taken away by her birth mother. Thea's response: when faced with life's many uncertainties, the answer is never going to be love less. If that's the answer you come up with, then you're asking the wrong questions. Love is risky. Whenever we feel threatened in times of crisis, our instinct is to draw all of our resources in close. We become defensive, lest someone take something that we think we have to survive. I get it. But that's not God's way. In the creation itself, God took the risk that we would stray from the path, even become mean to each other, and to forget the God who made us. But God created anyway, filling everything with divine love and life and calling everything good. And it's not the way of the people of God either. God did not call us because we were special or for the purpose of hoarding all the blessings that for ourselves, but out of love. And because God first loved us, we love others. Because we once were lost but now are found, we seek to bring others into this fold of God's embrace. By faith, we feed the hungry, bind up the brokenhearted, and welcome the stranger, because that's what God has done for us. By faith, we grieve for those killed in schools and places of worship, in homes and on the streets, and we keep working for the day when violence will cease. By faith, we keep loving those society has written off. We keep treating every human being with dignity and respect. We look into the storms of division in the world and despair in our own hearts and face them with confident hope. By faith, we draw strength from the past, even as we lean into the future, looking forward with Abraham and Sarah and all of our ancestors in the faith to that city with strong foundations, whose architect and builder is God. This is who we are. We are a pilgrim people going where God leads us, always on the move, regardless of what happens on the journey. Go to a land that I will show you. That's our calling. So keep reaching. We keep hoping, regardless of the obstacles. Poet Sarah Kay describes this perspective in one of her poems. There'll be days like this. There'll be days like this, my mama said, when you open your hand to catch and wind up with only blisters and bruises. When you step out of the phone booth and try to fly, and the very people you want to save are the ones standing on your cape. When your boots will fill with rain and you'll be up to your knees in disappointment. And those are the very days you have all the more reason to say thank you. Because there's nothing more beautiful than the way the ocean refuses to stop kissing the shoreline, no matter how many times it's swept away. Amen.